World Fairy Tales. The Story of Sleeping Beauty. Once upon a time there was a king and queen who were unhappy because they had no children. Even though their kingdom was prosperous and the people lived in peace, the absence of a child made them feel sad all the time. One day when the queen was bathing in the palace lake, a frog jumped out of the water onto the edge of the lake. It's strange that the frog can talk. Your wish will soon be granted. Before the turn of the year you will have a daughter. What the frog said came true. The queen conceived and finally gave birth to a very beautiful little girl. The king and queen were so happy that they threw a big party which was celebrated by the whole kingdom. At the palace he not only invited relatives, friends and courtiers, but also noble women who were considered wise. In that kingdom there were 13 great women, but because there were only 12 gold plates, the king and queen only invited 12 of them. This party was held with all kinds of splendor, and when it ended the great wise women one by one gave gifts in the form of magic to the princess, some in the form of virtue, beauty, wealth and others. When the 11th noble lady finished giving gifts in the form of magic, suddenly the 13th noble lady entered the palace. He wanted to repay the king and queen for not inviting him, and without saying a word, or even looking at anyone, he cried in a loud voice, "The king's daughter at the age of 15 will die from being pricked by a sewing needle." And, without saying a word, he turned and left the room. They were all shocked. Then the 12th noble lady who had yet to present the gift immediately stepped forward. Unfortunately he was unable to undo the 13th great female's curse, he could only moderate the curse. He said, "Princess will not die of needle sticks at the age of 15, she will only fall asleep. And will wake up after 100 years from the time he was pricked with a sewing needle." The king, who wanted to prevent his beloved daughter from being cursed by the 13th woman, immediately ordered that all sewing needles should not be around the palace. Meanwhile the magical gifts of the great women came true. The princess grew up to be a princess who was beautiful, kind, intelligent, wise, and everyone who saw her became bound to love her. One day, when the princess was 15, the king and queen were leaving the palace to pay a visit to another kingdom. The princess felt free and wandered around the palace. He visited various places, and in one corner of the kingdom he saw an old tower. The princess was very curious about the tower and entered it. He climbed up the narrow winding stairs, and saw a small door. The rusty key seemed to be stuck to the small door. The princess then opened the door slowly. In the room there is an old woman sewing clothes and looks very busy. "Good afternoon, mother. What are you doing?" "Who is the princess?" "I'm sewing and embroidering," replied the old woman. "How beautiful mother's embroidery, I really like it." The princess stroked the cloth the old woman had embroidered. But unfortunately the clothes still had sewing needles, and the princess's index finger was accidentally pricked by the needle. Instantly the princess's body became limp and fell to the floor fast asleep. What happened to the princess spread throughout the kingdom. The king and queen who had just returned to the palace, suddenly fell asleep. The whole court, the horses, went to sleep in the stables, the dogs in the yard, the doves on the roof, the flies on the walls, even the fire burning in the fireplace became calm down and sleep. Around the palace began to grow a hedge of thorns, which grew higher every year, and finally grew to enclose the entire palace, so high that the thorns became like an enclosing fortress so that even the palace could not be seen from the outside. But the story of the sleeping princess who was beautiful and charming spread widely to other kingdoms. From time to time princes would come and try to get past the barbed fence and into the palace. But no one has ever managed to do it, even some of them actually trapped by a hedge of thorns and died there in a sad way. After many years the news of a beautiful sleeping beauty reached the ears of a dashing prince from a foreign country. Although the news about the fort of thorn trees which was very dangerous was very frightening, it did not stop the dashing prince from trying to break through it. The prince said, "I am not afraid, I will go and meet the beautiful sleeping beauty." When the dashing prince came to the kingdom of the sleeping princess which was protected by the thorn tree fort, it coincided with 100 years from the day the princess was pricked by a sewing needle. When the dashing prince came to the outside of the palace, suddenly the thorny tree became a beautiful flower plant, and at the same time opened the way for the prince to go deeper. When the prince finally arrived at the palace, he saw dogs sleeping in the courtyard, as well as horses in stables, on the roof doves sleeping with their heads under their wings. The prince was even more amazed when he entered the palace. He saw flies sleeping on the palace walls, and the cook was still sleeping with his cooking utensils in the kitchen. Everyone in the palace was in a deep sleep. The prince finally went around the palace and found silence because everything he saw was in a deep sleep. In a corner of the prince's palace, he was curious about the old tower that looked unkempt. He climbed up the narrow winding stairs, and saw a tiny little door was ajar. Inside he saw the enchanting beautiful princess sleeping gracefully. The dashing prince could not take his eyes off the beautiful sleeping princess. As if by magic he approached the princess, bent down and kissed her on the forehead. A miracle happened that the princess who had been sleeping for years suddenly woke up. The dashing prince then told what had happened. The two of them then came out of the old tower hand in hand, and at the same time the king and queen had also woken up from their sleep, including all the palace officials who looked at each other in amazement. And the horses in the yard stood up and shook themselves, the dogs jumped up and wagged their tails, the doves on the roof opened their wings and put out their heads, looked around and then flew into the sky, the flies on the walls crawled again, the palace came back to life, wake up from their long sleep. The king, queen and the entire kingdom were overjoyed that the 13th great lady's curse had been broken. And because the prince and the princess fell in love with each other, they held a magnificent wedding which was held in all corners of the palace. The Sleeping Beauty and the dashing prince lived happily until the end of their lives. The moral of the world's fairy tales: the story of Sleeping Beauty is, always maintain good relations with other people, because what we do can hurt other people and make them act badly.